Hello there, and welcome to Sleep Through Ages. Before we begin, I'd love to hear where in the world you're listening from. So, wherever you are tonight, let's drift back to a city that once seemed perfectly ordinary and discover the hidden geometry beneath its streets. Tonight we're stepping into Berlin, on the eve of division, often remembered as a single wall rising overnight, but better understood as a slow hardening of lines, habits, and fears, where commutes, kitchen table decisions, and quiet departures became as powerful as armies and treaties. On the surface, Berlin is a city of ordinary distances, a river that curves gently through neighborhoods, wide avenues lined with chestnut trees, apartment blocks that glow amber in the early evening when kitchen lights switch on one by one. If you stand still long enough, you can hear bicycles moving over cobblestones, the distant hum of a tram, the soft murmur of conversation drifting from an open window. It feels like a city built for walking. But beneath all of this, Berlin has always carried a second map. Not one you unfold in your hands, not one marked in bright colors or bold lines. This second map exists in memory, in habit, in stories told quietly over coffee. It is a map of borders that were once invisible, then concrete. A map of streets that once connected freely, and then did not. In simple terms, Berlin lived by two clocks. One clock measured ordinary time, morning deliveries, school bells, factory whistles, the evening news. The other clock measured historical time, occupation zones, military agreements, and the careful positioning of power. After the Second World War ended in 1945, Germany did not simply rebuild itself. It was divided. The victorious Allies, the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, carved the defeated nation into four zones of occupation. Berlin, though located deep within the Soviet zone, was also divided into four sectors. At first, this arrangement was meant to be temporary, a way to administer a defeated country while deciding what would come next. But temporary structures can harden. Lines drawn in pencil can be traced over in ink. By 1949, two separate German states had emerged. In the West, the Federal Republic of Germany. In the East, the German Democratic Republic, the GDR. Berlin became the anomaly. West Berlin, supported by the Western Allies, functioned like an island of capitalism and parliamentary democracy, surrounded on all sides by East Germany. East Berlin became the capital of the GDR, a showcase for a socialist experiment that promised equality, industrial progress, and a different kind of modern future. At first, the border within Berlin did not feel like a border at all. It was a line you could cross on foot. People did so constantly. A woman might live in the East but work in the West. A student might attend lectures across the sector boundary. Families divided by occupation zones continued to meet for Sunday meals. Markets flowed. Conversations flowed. The city breathed through its seams. But beneath that surface normality, something subtle was shifting. The GDR faced a quiet, persistent problem. People were leaving. Not in dramatic columns, not with banners or speeches. They left individually or in small family groups. A suitcase, a train ride, a decision made at a kitchen table. Between 1949 and 1961, nearly 2.7 million East Germans migrated to the West. Many were young. Many were skilled. Doctors, engineers, teachers, mechanics. Students who had not yet built their lives. Workers who wanted more choices. For the East German leadership, this was not merely embarrassing. It was destabilizing. A state can manage dissent. It can manage scarcity. It can even manage isolation. But it struggles to manage disappearance. Every person who left took something with them: labor, knowledge, hope, momentum. The drain was not loud, but it was steady, like water slipping through a narrow crack in stone. Berlin was the crack. Elsewhere along the border between East and West Germany, crossings were more controlled. Fences existed. Patrols existed. But inside Berlin, the sector boundary remained permeable. To leave the GDR, you simply had to reach West Berlin. And reaching West Berlin, for many, was not difficult. So while daily life in the city continued, trams rattling, shopkeepers arranging displays, children walking to school, conversations in government offices grew more tense. Behind closed doors, leaders studied numbers, charts, migration statistics, labor shortages, agricultural output. They spoke not in dramatic language, but in administrative terms. Sustainability, stability, security. In June of 1961, the East German leader Walter Ulbricht addressed a press conference. When asked about rumors of a wall being built, he replied, calmly, that no one had the intention of building such a structure. The sentence would later echo with irony. But at the time, the statement reassured some and confused others. The idea of a physical barrier cutting through Berlin seemed almost absurd. The city had endured war, airlifts, blockades. Surely it would not be sliced in two. And yet, beneath public assurances, preparations were quietly advancing. Materials were staged. Units were briefed. Plans were refined. In the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev weighed options. The Cold War had sharpened. Nuclear weapons existed on both sides of the divide. Direct confrontation risked catastrophe. But the ongoing exodus from East Germany also posed a strategic threat. If the GDR weakened too much, the balance of power in Europe might tilt decisively. The solution, from a certain perspective, seemed almost surgical. If you could not stop people from wanting to leave, you could make leaving physically difficult. On the evening of August 12, 1961, Berlin did not feel dramatically different. Couples went to the cinema. Friends met in cafes. Radios played music through open windows. A summer Saturday settled gently into night. But sometime after midnight, trucks began to move. Soldiers and police units deployed toward the sector boundary. Rolls of barbed wire were unloaded. Concrete posts were positioned. Streets were blocked. Rail lines were interrupted. By dawn on August 13, Berliners woke to a transformed city. Barbed wire now stretched across intersections. Armed guards stood where pedestrians had walked freely the day before. Tram lines ended abruptly. Subway routes were cut. Families found themselves separated not by distance, but by wire. A grandmother who had expected a Sunday visit from her grandchildren now stood on one side of a barrier, waving across a line she could not cross. A worker who had planned to report to his job in the West discovered that his path was sealed. The border had not been debated publicly. It had not unfolded gradually. It had appeared. At first, it was not yet the towering concrete structure that would later define the Cold War. It was wire, patrols, and warning signs. But the message was clear. Movement was no longer casual. In West Berlin, crowds gathered near the new barriers. There was confusion, anger, disbelief. Allied troops remained in their sectors, but did not attempt to dismantle the wire. The risk of military escalation loomed too large. President John F. Kennedy would later remark that a wall, however grim, was preferable to war. So the wire stayed. Over the following days and weeks, the temporary measures hardened. Barbed wire gave way to more permanent fencing. Guard towers rose. Concrete segments replaced provisional barriers. The border became layered, an outer wall, a cleared strip of land, patrol roads, signal fences, and an inner wall facing East Berlin. The cleared strip would later be known as the Death Strip, though in these early months it was simply a space of absence. Buildings near the boundary were evacuated. Windows facing west were bricked up. Streets that had once carried traffic were truncated into dead ends. The city's circulatory system was interrupted. Daily routines shifted. Commuters adjusted. Some who had worked in the West found new employment in the East. Others, trapped on the wrong side of their plans, faced abrupt reinvention. The wall did not only divide geography, it divided expectation. And yet, life continued. Markets reopened. Schools resumed. Newspapers printed carefully framed explanations. Official language described the barrier as an anti-fascist protective rampart, a defensive measure to shield the socialist state. But in kitchens and living rooms, people understood something simpler. The wall was not built to keep outsiders out. It was built to keep insiders in. At night, floodlights illuminated the border. Guards patrolled in pairs. The ground was raked smooth, so footprints could be detected. Over time, the structure grew taller, smoother, more formidable. But even in its earliest days, the psychological shift was profound. A city accustomed to crossing itself had been instructed to stop. Berlin's two clocks were now visibly misaligned. One still measured ordinary time, breakfast, work, supper. The other ticked with a new regularity, patrol schedules, watch shifts, inspections. Children growing up in the 1960s would learn the shape of the wall the way other children learned the course of a river. It was simply there. A fact. A boundary that defined their map of the possible. Yet beneath the concrete and wire, another current moved. People watched, measured, tested. Some studied train tunnels. Others counted guard rotations. Still others simply waited. Because no wall, however solid, is ever only concrete. It is also a question. And in Berlin, in August of 1961, that question had just been asked. The city did not yet know how it would answer. On the surface, the Berlin Wall was a line, a boundary you could point to on a map, a strip of concrete that curved and angled through neighborhoods, along canals, across cemeteries, through railway yards. It measured roughly 155 kilometers in total, encircling West Berlin, about 43 kilometers of it slicing directly through the heart of the city. But beneath all of this, the wall was never just a line. It was a system. In simple terms, the wall was designed not only to stand, but to observe. In the early weeks after August 13, 1961, the barrier was crude. Barbed wire coils tangled along sidewalks. Concrete posts were anchored into hastily dug holes. Armed guards stood in doorways that no longer opened onto anything. Windows of apartment buildings along the border were sealed with bricks. In some cases, entire buildings were cleared and later demolished, leaving a sudden emptiness where rooms had once held furniture, photographs, conversations. The city adjusted, with a kind of stunned quiet. Yet the East German leadership understood that wire alone was temporary. Wire can be cut. It can be stepped over. It can be challenged by momentum and courage. So over the next months and years, the barrier evolved. Gradually, the wall became layered. Closest to East Berlin stood what was called the inner wall. Beyond that lay a broad cleared space, sand or gravel raked smooth each day so that any footprint could be detected. This strip was illuminated at night by floodlights mounted on tall poles. Guard towers rose at intervals, square silhouettes against the sky. Further out stood a signal fence wired with alarms. If touched, it would silently alert nearby posts. Behind that were patrol roads for vehicles, trenches to stop cars from ramming through, and finally the outer wall, the concrete face visible from West Berlin. By the mid-1970s, the most recognizable version of the structure emerged. Tall, prefabricated concrete segments about 3.6 meters high, topped with a rounded pipe designed to prevent grip. To those on the western side, it appeared stark, gray, impenetrable. To those on the eastern side, it was white, a high-contrast surface meant to make shadows visible under floodlights. At night, the border was brighter than most streets in the city. Floodlights washed the cleared strip in pale intensity. Guards walked in pairs. Dogs patrolled on long runs. The ground was carefully maintained, a canvas of sand that recorded movement. The space between the walls became known as the Death Strip, though the name emerged gradually, shaped by stories and incidents that traveled quietly across neighborhoods. But daily life in Berlin did not freeze in place. Shops opened each morning. Trams resumed their routes, now shortened. Schools reorganized catchment areas. The U-Bahn and S-Bahn systems, once seamlessly integrated, became fractured. Certain stations in East Berlin through which Western trains still passed were closed and dimly lit, guarded and silent. These became known as ghost stations. Passengers on Western trains would glide slowly through these abandoned platforms, glimpsing uniformed guards beneath low lamps, then disappear back into tunnels. It was a strange kind of coexistence. The city did not stop functioning. It functioned around the obstacle. For the East German state, the wall did what it was designed to do. The large-scale migration slowed dramatically. The sudden drain of skilled workers halted. Economic planning, at least in demographic terms, became more predictable. But beneath the statistics lay another dynamic. When movement is restricted, attention intensifies. People studied the wall. They memorized patrol timings. They observed blind spots in floodlight patterns. They listened. Escape attempts began almost immediately. Some were impulsive, individuals sprinting toward the wire in the early days, before fortifications were complete. Others were methodical. Windows near the border became launch points. In Bernauer Straße, buildings directly on the boundary created surreal scenes. Residents could jump from upper-story windows into nets held by West Berlin firefighters below. Soon, those windows were bricked up. As the barrier hardened, escape attempts grew more inventive. Tunnels were dug beneath streets and courtyards. In the sandy soil of Berlin, digging was possible, though unstable. Teams worked quietly at night, removing earth in suitcases, listening for vibrations that might indicate detection. Some tunnels succeeded. Dozens passed through before discovery. Others collapsed. In one well-known case, later called Tunnel 57, 57 people escaped through a narrow underground passage before East German authorities uncovered it. Elsewhere, individuals modified cars with hidden compartments. Others built homemade hot air balloons from sewn fabric and propane burners, drifting silently over the floodlit strip in the early morning darkness. There were attempts by swimming, by improvised zip lines, by concealed compartments in vehicles. Each attempt carried risk. The border guards, the Grenstroppen, were young men performing compulsory service. They stood long hours in watchtowers, instructed to prevent illegal crossings. Their orders were strict. Over the decades, at least 140 people were killed attempting to cross in Berlin, though exact numbers remain debated. But for the purpose of understanding daily life, it is important to remember that most days passed without dramatic confrontation. The wall was less often a scene of action than a scene of stillness. It created a new rhythm. In West Berlin, the concrete surface facing outward gradually became a canvas. Artists painted slogans, murals, political messages. Layers of color accumulated. The wall there became textured with protest and creativity. In East Berlin, the inner face remained largely untouched. It was part of a controlled zone. Approaching it required authorization. Thus, the same structure presented two radically different appearances, one vibrant and chaotic, the other sterile and monitored. The contrast became symbolic. Meanwhile, diplomacy adjusted. In 1963, U.S. President John F. Kennedy visited West Berlin and declared, "Ich bin ein Berliner." The speech reinforced the Western commitment to the city, but it did not remove the wall. In 1971, the Four-Power Agreement on Berlin eased certain travel and visitation rules. Families separated by the border could apply for limited permits. Pensioners in East Berlin were sometimes allowed to visit the West. Western visitors could obtain day visas to cross into the East. Life at the checkpoints developed its own choreography. Checkpoint Charlie became internationally known, a crossing point for diplomats, military personnel, and authorized civilians. Passport inspections were methodical, often tense but quiet. The ritual of stamping documents, lowering barriers, raising them again, became part of Berlin's daily theater. For many East Germans, however, travel to the West remained impossible without special permission. And yet, within the GDR, life continued in structured predictability. Apartments were allocated by the state. Childcare was widely available. Employment was guaranteed, though wages were modest. Consumer goods were often scarce or delayed, but stability existed in other forms: predictable careers, subsidized holidays, organized youth groups. In simple terms, the wall did not eliminate daily routines. It reorganized them. Over time, a generation grew up that had no memory of an open Berlin. Children in the 1970s learned geography with the wall as a given. They sketched maps that stopped abruptly at its outline. They visited relatives only with permits. They saw West Berlin on television signals that drifted across the border despite official discouragement. Television became one of the quiet contradictions of the divided city. Many East German households could receive Western broadcasts. News, advertisements, entertainment programs, glimpses of another consumer landscape flickered into living rooms each evening. The wall blocked physical movement, but it could not fully block signals. This created a subtle tension. Official media described the West in critical terms, emphasizing unemployment, inequality, instability. But the images on television showed full supermarkets, diverse fashions, cars in bright colors. For some viewers, these images created longing. For others, they created skepticism. For many, they simply became background comparison, another layer in the mental map of difference. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, the wall had become normalized. Tourists in West Berlin could approach it, take photographs, chip small fragments from its outer surface. On guided tours, buses drove along its length. Visitors listened to explanations through headsets, observing watchtowers through telephoto lenses. In the East, it remained an operational security structure. Maintenance crews inspected segments. Guards rotated shifts. Sand was raked smooth each morning. But no system remains static forever. Beneath the apparent solidity, small pressures accumulated. The GDR's economy faced chronic inefficiencies. Industrial output lagged behind Western standards. Environmental degradation worsened in certain regions. Access to foreign currency, necessary for importing advanced technology, remained limited. The wall had stabilized population loss, but it had not resolved deeper structural challenges. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, a generational shift was beginning. By the mid-1980s, Mikhail Gorbachev rose to leadership and introduced policies known as glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. These reforms aimed to revitalize a stagnating system through transparency and limited economic change. Though initiated in Moscow, their influence rippled outward. In Eastern Europe, reform movements gained confidence. In Poland, the Solidarity movement pressed for labor rights and political reform. In Hungary, economic experimentation and gradual liberalization altered the atmosphere. The architecture of division that had once seemed permanent began to feel subtly negotiable. In Berlin, the wall still stood, floodlit and monitored. But history's second clock was beginning to tick differently. The structure had been engineered to stop movement. It had succeeded for nearly 3 decades. Yet systems are not only made of concrete and orders. They are made of belief. And belief, unlike reinforced segments, can shift quietly, sometimes without visible cracks, until one day the structure it supports no longer stands quite as firmly as it once did. Berlin did not yet know how close it was to another turning point. But beneath the floodlights, beneath the sand and steel, beneath the daily routines of inspection and patrol, something intangible was adjusting. The wall was solid, but the certainty around it was beginning to thin. On the surface, the Berlin Wall in the early 1980s appeared unchanged. The concrete segments stood in their familiar rhythm. The rounded pipes caught the pale light of winter mornings. Guard towers punctuated the skyline at regular intervals. Sand was raked. Patrol roads were swept. Floodlights were tested at dusk. Routine had become the architecture's greatest strength. For nearly 2 decades, the wall had done what it was built to do. The dramatic exodus of the 1950s had stopped. The border was sealed not only by material, but by habit. A generation had grown up inside its perimeter. Children who were born after 1961 were now adults. For them, the wall was not a rupture in memory. It was a permanent feature of geography. They had learned to navigate within it. In simple terms, the extraordinary had become ordinary. But beneath all of this, the edges of the system were beginning to shift. Not in Berlin at first. Not along the brightly lit strip of sand. The changes began further out, in places that seemed peripheral to the concrete certainty of the German border. In Poland, the Solidarity movement had risen in the shipyards of Gdansk. What began as a labor protest became something broader, a demand for independent unions, for dialogue, for reform. Though martial law was imposed in 1981, the idea that socialist governments could be challenged without immediate Soviet invasion began to circulate. In Hungary, economic reforms quietly expanded. The government experimented with limited market mechanisms. Travel restrictions eased incrementally. The tone of official language softened. And in Moscow, a new leader had emerged. Mikhail Gorbachev did not immediately dismantle the Soviet system, but his policies, glasnost and perestroika, introduced a new vocabulary: openness, restructuring, debate. These words traveled faster than directives. Inside East Germany, life in the mid-1980s remained structured and familiar. Factories operated on planned quotas. Apartment blocks rose in prefabricated panels. Children attended state schools, joined youth organizations, learned songs about solidarity and progress. Consumer goods were limited but predictable. There were waiting lists for cars, for certain appliances, for larger apartments. Holidays were often spent on the Baltic coast or in the mountains of Saxony. Stability was the promise. Yet stability can become stillness. By the late 1980s, economic strain was more visible. Industrial infrastructure aged. Environmental damage, particularly air pollution from lignite coal, affected daily life. Citizens noticed the contrast with Western broadcasts more sharply. Television continued to slip through the barrier. Evening news from West Germany presented different images: open political debates, diverse newspapers, full store shelves. For many East Germans, the comparison was no longer abstract. It was nightly. Still, the wall held. What began to change in 1989 did not begin with a hammer. It began with wire cutters. In May of that year, Hungary started dismantling sections of its border fence with Austria. Officially, the move was described as modernization, replacing outdated surveillance equipment. But practically, it meant something larger. For the first time in decades, a gap in the Iron Curtain appeared. East Germans were allowed to travel within other socialist countries for holidays. Hungary, with its lakes and mild summers, was a popular destination. And so, in the summer of 1989, families packed as they always had swimsuits, folding chairs, thermoses of coffee. They drove south. But this time, many were not looking for beaches. They were looking for possibility. At first, the numbers were small. Individuals who slipped through wooded sections of the border. Couples who quietly crossed into Austria and then made their way to West Germany. Hungarian border guards faced a dilemma. Their orders were no longer as clear as they once had been. The Soviet Union signaled that it would not intervene militarily in Eastern Europe's internal affairs. The old certainty that tanks would roll if necessary had faded. On August 19, 1989, a symbolic event known as the Pan-European Picnic was organized near the Hungarian-Austrian border. It was intended as a gesture, a temporary opening of a gate for a few hours to celebrate European unity. But hundreds of East Germans who had been waiting nearby saw the open gate and moved. The Hungarian guards hesitated, and then they did not fire. In that hesitation, something profound shifted. Word traveled quickly. More East Germans traveled to Hungary. Some camped near the border, waiting for opportunities. Others gathered at the West German embassy in Budapest, seeking refuge. By September 11, Hungary officially opened its border to East German citizens. Thousands crossed within days. The GDR leadership in East Berlin watched with growing alarm. The pressure valve of controlled socialist travel had become an exit route. Closing the Hungarian route was possible only by pressuring another socialist government to reverse course, and Hungary refused. Meanwhile, demonstrations inside East Germany were increasing. In Leipzig, a tradition of Monday evening prayers for peace had slowly transformed into public gatherings. At first, small groups exited churches holding candles. They walked quietly, asking for reform, for dialogue, for travel rights. Week by week, the numbers grew. The slogan, "Wir sind das Volk," "We are the people," echoed through city squares. The phrase was simple. It did not call for immediate reunification. It called for accountability. On October 7, 1989, the GDR celebrated its 40th anniversary. Parades marched through East Berlin. Foreign dignitaries attended ceremonies. Speeches praised socialist achievements. Mikhail Gorbachev was present. Crowds gathered outside official events, chanting. The contrast between the choreographed spectacle and the spontaneous gatherings was stark. Gorbachev reportedly warned East German leader Erich Honecker that those who fail to adapt risk being overtaken by events. Within weeks, Honecker resigned. But the system did not immediately soften. On October 9, in Leipzig, 70,000 people marched. Security forces prepared for the possibility of force. Hospitals increased readiness. Blood supplies were stocked. Yet the order to crack down did not come. Local officials hesitated. Perhaps they feared international reaction. Perhaps they sensed the scale of the crowd made violence untenable. The demonstration remained peaceful, and something irreversible occurred. The state had demonstrated publicly that it would not use overwhelming force. From that moment, the psychology of fear shifted. Demonstrations spread to Dresden, to Berlin, to other cities. Numbers swelled into the hundreds of thousands. The wall still stood. Guards still patrolled. But the narrative of permanence was eroding. East Germans were not yet storming checkpoints. They were walking in the streets. In simple terms, movement had returned, not across the border, but within the system. By early November, the GDR leadership attempted to manage change through administrative reform. A new travel regulation was drafted, allowing citizens to apply for private trips abroad under certain conditions. The intention was controlled relaxation. But on the evening of November 9, 1989, the announcement was mishandled. At a press conference, Politburo member Günter Schabowski was asked when the new travel rules would take effect. Uncertain and scanning his notes, he replied that they would take effect immediately, without delay. Television carried the statement live. West German news broadcasts quickly interpreted it as the opening of the border. Within minutes, Berlin's other clock accelerated. Crowds began moving toward checkpoints, Bornholmer Strasse, Checkpoint Charlie, others along the line. They did not carry tools. They carried identity cards. At the crossings, guards awaited clarification from superiors. Phones rang. Orders were unclear. The chain of command faltered. By late evening, thousands had gathered at Bornholmer Strasse. The pressure was not violent, but insistent. Harold Yeger, the officer in charge at that crossing, faced a decision. With no clear directive and concern that the crowd might surge dangerously, he made a choice. He ordered the barrier opened. At approximately 11:30 p.m., East Berliners began crossing freely into the west. They were not met with gunfire. They were met with applause. West Berliners stood waiting with flowers, with sparkling wine, with disbelief. The wall had not yet been dismantled, but it had lost its function. Throughout the night, other crossings followed. Guards, uncertain and overwhelmed, lifted barriers. Stamps were abandoned. Procedures dissolved. People climbed onto the wall. They danced. They embraced strangers. Television cameras broadcast the scenes around the world. The floodlit strip that had once been a zone of surveillance became a space of celebration. In the early hours of November 10, Berliners from both sides wandered streets that had been inaccessible for 28 years. Trams adjusted. Subway lines resumed stops at ghost stations. Bridges reopened. It did not feel like conquest. It felt like release. In simple terms, the wall did not fall because it was attacked with force. It fell because it was opened, first administratively, then physically, then symbolically. The architecture of division remained standing for months afterward, but the certainty had vanished in a single evening. Berlin's two clocks, long out of sync, were suddenly aligned. And as dawn rose over the city on November 10, 1989, the floodlights were still shining, but they illuminated not isolation, but movement. The concrete had not yet been removed, but history had already stepped across it. On the surface, the Berlin Wall did not fall in a single dramatic collapse. No thunderous cracks split the concrete at midnight. No coordinated demolition crew arrived with cranes and sirens. The structure remained physically intact long after November 9, 1989. And yet, beneath all of this, something far more decisive occurred. The wall lost its meaning. The evening began with paperwork. At a press conference in East Berlin, Günter Schabowski shuffled through documents describing new travel regulations. The rules had been drafted in haste, an attempt by the East German government to ease pressure from mounting demonstrations. Citizens would be allowed to apply for private travel abroad. The intention was controlled reform, not open borders. When asked when the rules would take effect, Schabowski hesitated. As far as I know, immediately, without delay. The phrase moved faster than clarification. Television carried it live. Within minutes, West German news broadcasts interpreted the statement as an immediate opening of the border. In living rooms across East Berlin, people paused mid-sentence. Cups were set down. Coats were retrieved from hooks. Identity cards slipped into pockets. No one had been instructed to gather. They simply did. By 8:30 p.m., small groups were arriving at border crossings. Bornholmer Strasse in the north saw the first clusters, curious, cautious, expectant. The guards at the checkpoints had received no new instructions. Phones rang. Supervisors were called. The answer repeated itself in various forms: wait. But crowds do not wait in straight lines. By 9:00 p.m., thousands stood before the barriers. They were not shouting aggressively. They were asking questions. Let us through. You announced it. We have the right. The guards, mostly young men, felt the weight of uncertainty more than hostility. They had been trained for decades to prevent crossings. Yet the state television announcement contradicted their standing orders. In simple terms, the system had outrun itself. At Bornholmer Strasse, Lieutenant Colonel Harold Yeager faced mounting pressure. He telephoned superiors repeatedly, seeking authorization. Responses were vague. No one wanted to issue an order that might trigger escalation. The crowd continued to grow. There is a particular sound when thousands of people murmur at once, not shouting, but speaking over each other. It resembles the steady wash of distant surf. By 10:30 p.m., the sound filled the air. Some in the front rows began chanting, "Open the gate," not angrily, but insistently. Others simply waited, arms folded, holding identity cards like tickets to a train that had not yet arrived. Behind them, more people pressed forward, not violently, but by sheer presence. The pressure became physical. Yeja faced a choice not written in any manual. He could order force, which risked chaos, injury, perhaps worse. Or he could open the barrier. At 11:30 p.m., he instructed his men to lift it. The metal arm rose slowly. For a moment, no one moved. Then someone stepped forward. Then another. Then dozens. The first East Berliners crossed into West Berlin cautiously, almost as if expecting the scene to reverse. On the other side, West Berliners had already gathered, alerted by television and rumor. They applauded. Some handed out flowers. Others uncorked bottles of sparkling wine. Strangers embraced. The checkpoint, designed for scrutiny, transformed into a passage of celebration. Within minutes, the trickle became a stream. Guards initially attempted to stamp passports to mark official departure, but the pace overwhelmed procedure. Eventually, they stopped checking documents altogether. Elsewhere along the border, similar scenes unfolded. At Checkpoint Charlie, the iconic crossing in the city center, crowds swelled as word spread. In Walleidenstrasse, Oberbaumbrück, and other points saw gathering waves of people. The choreography of control dissolved. In West Berlin, drivers honked horns in spontaneous rhythm. Cars filled with cheering passengers circled major streets. The blue haze of two-stroke engines from East German Trabants mingled with the exhaust of Western sedans. People climbed onto the wall itself. This act, once unthinkable, became symbolic within minutes. Young men pulled each other up. Women followed. They stood silhouetted against floodlights that had been installed to monitor escape attempts. Now those same lights illuminated dancers. Television cameras broadcast the images worldwide. The concrete, once a barrier, became a stage. But inside the night, it did not feel like spectacle. It felt intimate. Families who had been separated for years crossed cautiously, unsure whether they would be allowed to return. Some wept quietly. Others walked in stunned silence. West Berlin had a policy known as Begrüßungsgeld, welcome money. Visitors from the East were entitled to receive 100 Deutschmarks as a gesture of hospitality. Banks and post offices were unprepared for the surge. Lines formed quickly. Shops along Kurfürstendamm remained open late. East Berliners wandered aisles, touching products they had previously seen only on television. Bananas, oranges, brightly packaged detergents, ordinary goods acquired the quality of marvels. Yet many did not buy anything. They simply looked. The first night was less about consumption than about crossing. Meanwhile, East Berlin remained active. Many who crossed returned home before dawn, unwilling to abandon apartments, jobs, routines without clarity. This was not yet an exodus. It was a visitation. Trains resumed stops at stations that had been closed for decades. The so-called ghost stations, dim platforms guarded and unused, came alive. Dust rose from tracks long undisturbed by passengers. Transit workers improvised. Schedules were adjusted. Barriers were dismantled in stages. Bridges reopened. The city, which had functioned as two systems for 28 years, began tentatively reconnecting. By early morning, the atmosphere shifted from disbelief to exhaustion. After hours of movement, Berliners leaned against walls, sat on curbs, laughed softly. The floodlights still shone across the former death strip, but no one regarded it as lethal anymore. In simple terms, the psychological border had evaporated before the physical one. In the days that followed, the wall did not immediately disappear. It stood, awkward and obsolete. Citizens began chipping away at it with hammers and chisels. These individuals were soon nicknamed Mauerspecht, wall woodpeckers. Small fragments of concrete became souvenirs, passed from hand to hand. The sound of metal striking stone echoed along the border. Authorities eventually brought in cranes and heavy machinery to remove larger segments. But during those first nights, dismantling was intimate. A chip here, a crack there. Each fragment removed carried disproportionate symbolic weight. On November 12, Brandenburg Gate, long sealed behind layers of barrier, reopened partially for pedestrians. Crowds filled Pariser Platz. Flags waved. Music played. Yet political questions loomed. Reunification had not yet been negotiated. The German Democratic Republic still existed as a state. Soviet troops remained stationed on East German soil. Diplomats in Washington, Moscow, London, and Paris convened emergency discussions. The four-power status of Berlin, a relic of 1945, had not automatically dissolved. The night of November 9 had outrun formal agreements. But within Berlin itself, practical concerns took precedence. How would utilities reconnect? How would transport systems merge? What of property claims on land seized decades earlier? For the moment, none of this overshadowed the immediacy of the crossing. For those who stood on the wall that night, the horizon looked different. Not because the skyline had changed, the Fernsehturm still rose above Alexanderplatz, the Reichstag still stood near the border, but because the sense of enclosure had lifted. The city felt larger. By the end of November, more than 2 million East Germans had crossed into West Berlin at least once. Many returned home after brief visits. They went back to workplaces, to schools, to apartments that now felt both familiar and unsettled. Because once you cross a border that was supposed to be permanent, permanence becomes negotiable. The wall, engineered as a layered defense system, had relied on obedience as much as concrete. When obedience faltered, the structure's authority dissolved. There were no pitched battles, no grand military confrontation. The fall of the Berlin Wall was administrative, psychological, communal. It was the lifting of a barrier that had long depended on belief. And so the night of November 9/10 was less a demolition than a redefinition. The concrete did not crumble instantly, but its purpose did. In the weeks ahead, negotiations would formalize what had already begun. Currency union, elections, treaties. But on that first night, none of those terms had been drafted. There were only footsteps. Footsteps across bridges that had once been closed. Footsteps across sand that had once been smoothed for detection. Footsteps across a threshold that had quietly, almost accidentally, opened. And beneath the floodlights, beneath the cheering and the television cameras, beneath the sound of hammers striking concrete, Berlin exhaled. Its two clocks, separated for nearly 3 decades, began ticking together again. The wall still stood in fragments. But it no longer commanded the city's rhythm. It had become, in a single evening, a relic. On the surface, the Berlin Wall in the winter of 1989 looked unchanged. The concrete segments still cast long shadows. Watchtowers still rose above the cleared strip. Floodlight poles still stood in place. To a casual observer, the structure remained formidable. But beneath all of this, the wall had already entered a new category. It was no longer a barrier. It was a construction site. In simple terms, once the crossings opened, the wall became an engineering problem. The first days after November 9 were spontaneous. Citizens chipped away small pieces with hammers and chisels. Some carved initials. Others pocketed fragments as souvenirs. The sound of tapping, metallic, irregular, echoed across former border zones. But dismantling 96 miles of reinforced concrete required more than enthusiasm. By early 1990, heavy machinery began arriving. Cranes, hydraulic breakers, flatbed trucks. Construction crews surveyed the border's path, marking sections for removal. What had once been guarded terrain became an industrial workspace. The death strip, cleared for decades of vegetation and layered with sand, fencing, wiring, and patrol roads, revealed its complexity. Beneath the surface lay cables, drainage systems, foundations of demolished buildings, remnants of signal systems. Removing the wall meant untangling all of it. And there was another complication: ownership. When the wall had been erected in 1961, property lines were overridden. Buildings were seized, streets severed, land expropriated. Now, with reunification on the horizon, the question emerged: who legally owned the ground beneath the concrete? Some plots had belonged to families before the war. Others had been state property. In certain places, West Berlin and East Berlin cadastral records did not align. Lawyers, surveyors, and urban planners joined the cranes. The dismantling was not simply demolition. It was excavation of history. In March 1990, the German Democratic Republic held its first and only free parliamentary election. The outcome signaled clear support for rapid reunification with West Germany. Political momentum accelerated. On July 1, 1990, the currency, economic, and social union came into effect. The East German mark was replaced by the West German Deutschmark. For many East Germans, the arrival of the Deutschmark felt tangible: crisp banknotes, stable currency, access to broader markets. Savings were converted at generous rates for individuals. But beneath the surface of celebration lay structural consequences. East German industries had operated within a planned economy. Prices, wages, and supply chains were administratively managed. Productivity levels often lagged behind Western standards, but comparisons had been internal. Now overnight, East German factories faced open competition. Their goods were priced in hard currency. Labor costs effectively matched Western levels. The result was immediate and stark. Many enterprises proved uncompetitive. Production slowed. Orders declined. Plants that had employed thousands faced closure. The Treuhandanstalt, a vast state agency, was established to privatize and restructure more than 8,000 former state-owned enterprises. Its mandate was unprecedented: evaluate, sell, liquidate, or reorganize nearly the entire industrial base of the GDR. In simple terms, an economic system was being dismantled as thoroughly as the wall itself. For workers, this transformation was personal. Factories that had defined local identity for generations shut their gates. Machinery was auctioned. Offices emptied. Unemployment, previously almost unknown in official terms, surged. Entire regions, particularly in heavy industry and mining, experienced abrupt economic silence. At the same time, infrastructure improvements accelerated. Roads were repaved. Telecommunications networks were modernized. Western retail chains opened stores in former East German towns. Construction cranes dotted skylines from Rostock to Dresden. The former death strip within Berlin became one of Europe's largest urban redevelopment zones. Potsdamer Platz, once a barren expanse cut by concrete and wire, turned into a vast construction pit. International firms, Daimler-Benz, Sony, and others, invested heavily. Glass towers and modern plazas rose where watchtowers had once stood. In neighborhoods along Bernauer Strasse, segments of the wall were preserved intentionally as memorials. Decisions had to be made: how much to erase, how much to remember. Some argued for total removal, a clean slate. Others insisted on preservation as testimony. Ultimately, most of the wall was removed, but selected sections remained. The physical border gave way to a patchwork of parks, bike paths, museums, and development zones. Rail networks required careful reintegration. During division, the U-Bahn and S-Bahn systems had been truncated and rerouted. Now, engineers worked to reconnect lines severed for decades. Ghost stations were renovated, platforms scrubbed, signage updated, lighting replaced. Trains began to pass without hesitation through tunnels that had once symbolized separation. Bridges reopened fully to traffic. Streets that had ended abruptly in concrete were extended and repaved. Urban planners faced a city that had evolved in two different directions for 28 years. Utilities had to be synchronized: power grids, water systems, sewage networks. East Berlin's infrastructure often required modernization before full integration. Yet alongside physical integration came administrative absorption. On October 3, 1990, German reunification became official. The German Democratic Republic ceased to exist as a sovereign state. Its territory joined the Federal Republic of Germany under Article 23 of the Basic Law. The four-power rights over Berlin were formally ended through the 2+4 Treaty, signed by the two German states and the four Allied powers. For Berlin, the transition was immediate. Government institutions began relocating from Bonn back to Berlin. The Reichstag, long dormant, underwent extensive renovation. A glass dome was later added, symbolizing transparency in governance. Diplomatic missions relocated. Ministries moved files, personnel, equipment. The logistics of reunification were vast. In some cases, East German military equipment was dismantled or sold. Thousands of soldiers were demobilized. Police forces were reorganized. Legal systems harmonized. And beneath all of this was a quieter, more personal dismantling. The Ministry for State Security, the Stasi, had maintained extensive surveillance records on millions of citizens. As the regime collapsed, officials attempted to destroy files. Citizens occupied Stasi offices to prevent shredding. In the months that followed, archives were catalogued. Individuals gained the right to view files kept on them. Discoveries were painful. Friends, colleagues, even relatives were revealed as informants. The collapse of the wall exposed not only physical divisions, but hidden networks of mistrust. Meanwhile, in rural regions of the former GDR, depopulation accelerated. Many young people moved westward in search of employment. Entire towns lost significant portions of their population. The promise of rapid, blossoming landscapes, articulated by Chancellor Helmut Kohl, proved more complex than expected. Investment flowed eastward, billions in subsidies, infrastructure funding, social programs. A solidarity tax was introduced in the West to support rebuilding. Yet rebuilding did not immediately replace lost industries. Factories could be demolished in weeks. Economic ecosystems take years to regenerate. Back in Berlin, the former border zone transformed rapidly. Grass replaced sand. Trees were planted. Memorial plaques were installed. Tourists began to visit preserved sections, taking photographs where once photographs had been forbidden. Souvenir markets thrived briefly, selling authenticated segments of wall with certificates of origin. Concrete that had once enforced separation became collectible. The symbolism was striking. A structure built to prevent exit now exited the city in fragments, shipped to museums, displayed in gardens, incorporated into artworks around the world. But while the physical barrier receded, its imprint lingered. Housing markets differed between former East and West. Wage disparities persisted. Administrative leadership positions were disproportionately filled by West Germans. Cultural differences, subtle but real, surfaced in conversation, humor, work habits. The phrase Mauer im Kopf, the wall in the head, entered common usage. Reunification was not only territorial, it was psychological. Yet, despite friction and adjustment, the scale of peaceful transformation remained extraordinary. Within a single year, one state dissolved, another expanded. An entire military alliance's forward position vanished without major armed conflict. In simple terms, a geopolitical architecture was dismantled with paperwork and cranes rather than artillery. By the mid-1990s, Berlin no longer looked like a divided city. Construction cranes defined its skyline more than watchtowers ever had. Corporate headquarters rose along the Spree River. Cultural venues occupied former industrial spaces. The techno scene flourished in abandoned warehouses near the old border, repurposing emptiness into creativity. Potsdamer Platz shimmered with glass and steel where floodlights once scanned sand. And yet, in quieter corners, along the Bernauer Strasse Memorial, in preserved guard towers, in the subtle brass line embedded in pavement marking the wall's former path, reminders remained. You could walk the entire route of the former border, now a trail. Cyclists rode where patrol jeeps once circulated. Children played where searchlights once cast long shadows. The dismantling of the wall was not a single event. It was a process, mechanical, legal, economic, emotional. Cranes lifted concrete segments one by one. Legislators ratified treaties. Families navigated new labor markets. Archivists sorted documents. Each task was part of the same transformation. On the surface, the wall disappeared piece by piece. Beneath all of this, a system was dissolving and another was expanding. The work was not clean or painless, but it was deliberate. By the time the final watchtowers were removed, Berlin had already begun to imagine itself differently, not as a frontline city of the Cold War, but as the capital of a unified Germany at the center of Europe. The sand had been swept away, the floodlights dismantled, the patrol roads repurposed, and where the death strip had once cut through neighborhoods, there were now bike paths, memorial gardens, office towers, and open sky. The wall had been engineered to last generations. Instead, It lasted less than 30 years, and its removal required not just hammers and cranes, but patience, the careful stitching together of systems that had once evolved apart. In the quiet after demolition, Berlin did not return to what it had been. It became something new. On the surface, by the mid-1990s, Berlin no longer looked divided. Tourists could walk from Alexanderplatz to the Brandenburg Gate without encountering barriers. Subway lines ran continuously. Office buildings gleamed along former border zones. Cafes filled sidewalks where guard towers once stood. To an outsider, the city appeared seamlessly whole. But beneath all of this, another reconstruction was underway, one less visible than cranes and concrete. In simple terms, reunification removed the wall from the ground. It did not remove it from memory. For many East Germans, the early 1990s felt less like liberation and more like acceleration. The currency had changed overnight. The legal system had changed. The education system, the healthcare system, workplace structures, all shifted rapidly. What had once been familiar became obsolete. Factories that had employed thousands closed within months. Production lines that had run for decades fell silent. Entire industrial regions, especially in heavy manufacturing and mining, entered abrupt decline. Unemployment, which had been statistically negligible under the socialist system, rose dramatically. In some areas, it exceeded 20%. The silence of a closed factory is different from the silence of a border. A border separates. A factory sustains. When it stops, the quiet carries a different weight. In towns across the former GDR, men and women who had worked in the same plants for years found themselves navigating job centers, retraining programs, temporary contracts. Some adapted quickly. Younger workers often moved westward, seeking opportunity. Others stayed, hoping investment would arrive. A demographic shift began to unfold. Between 1990 and the early 2000s, millions of East Germans relocated to Western states. Many were young and highly educated. Women left in particularly high numbers, pursuing careers and independence in larger labor markets. The result was a thinning of rural eastern regions. Villages in Brandenburg, Saxony-Anhalt, and Mecklenburg saw declining school enrollments, closed clinics, empty storefronts. Meanwhile, cities like Leipzig and Dresden reinvented themselves gradually, attracting technology firms and cultural industries. Yet the urban-rural divide deepened. In simple terms, the East did not experience a single transition. It experienced multiple transitions at different speeds. Financial transfers from West to East were enormous. The solidarity surcharge, a tax levied to fund rebuilding, directed billions of euros annually into infrastructure and social programs. Highways were repaved, rail lines modernized, telecommunications leapfrogged directly to digital networks in many areas. Ironically, because East Germany's infrastructure was so outdated, modernization sometimes occurred faster than in the West. Fiber optic cables replaced corroded copper. New industrial parks were constructed with contemporary standards. But beneath these improvements lingered a more personal question. What happens when the life you built is declared structurally uncompetitive? Many East Germans felt that their qualifications, careers, and experiences were undervalued. Professional titles did not always transfer smoothly into the Western system. Academic degrees were reevaluated. Management positions often went to Western appointees. A phrase emerged in casual conversation, "Besser Wessi," a West German who supposedly knew better. Resentment was rarely explosive. It was quieter, more atmospheric. In office corridors, accents revealed origin. In job interviews, networks mattered. Representation in leadership roles lagged. Even decades later, East Germans remained underrepresented in elite positions in business, academia, and the judiciary. The physical wall had fallen, but an asymmetry persisted. At the same time, a peculiar nostalgia began to surface. Nostalgia, a blending of Ost, yeast, and nostalgia, described a longing not for the surveillance state or the border itself, but for aspects of daily life under socialism. Guaranteed employment, affordable childcare, a sense of collective rhythm. Familiar brands, Rotkäppchen sparkling wine, Vita Cola, Spreewald pickles, reappeared in stores. For some, these products symbolized continuity amid upheaval. For others, they were ironic artifacts. But the deeper impulse was identity preservation. When a state dissolves, so do its symbols. Flags disappear. Anthem lyrics fade. Public holidays change. For citizens who had lived most of their lives inside the GDR, the sudden erasure of those markers felt destabilizing. Remembering ordinary routines, summer vacations on the Baltic coast, school events, neighborhood solidarity, became a way to assert dignity. This memory work was not uniform. Younger generations, especially those who were children in 1989, navigated a hybrid identity more fluidly. They attended unified schools, consumed global media, and traveled freely. Berlin itself became a laboratory for reinvention. The vacant spaces along the former border attracted artists, musicians, and entrepreneurs. Abandoned, warehouses transformed into nightclubs. The techno scene emerged as a defining cultural export, drawing youth from across Europe. In dark, bass-filled rooms carved out of industrial remnants, East and West Berliners danced together without discussing politics. The former void between systems became a creative corridor. This cultural blending did not erase economic disparities, but it softened edges. Over time, visible differences between East and West Berlin narrowed. Property values fluctuated. Gentrification reshaped neighborhoods in Prenzlauer Berg and Friedrichshain. Yet further east, in rural districts, frustration simmered quietly. The sense of being a second-class citizen persisted in some communities. Statistics reinforced perception. Lower average wages, fewer corporate headquarters, higher unemployment rates in certain regions. These structural imbalances contributed to political shifts. By the 2010s, the alternative für Deutschland, AfD, gained significant support in eastern states. The party's messaging often emphasized disenfranchisement, sovereignty, and skepticism toward established elites. Observers debated causes, economic disparity, cultural divergence, demographic change. But beneath all of these analyses lay the memory of abrupt transformation. In simple terms, many East Germans experienced 1989 not only as liberation, but as systemic shock. A society can absorb change gradually, but compressed change leaves residue. The wall in the head, Mauer im Kopf, described this lingering separation. It referred not only to prejudice or misunderstanding, but to different lived experiences. For West Germans, reunification required adaptation, but not reinvention. Their institutions continued largely intact. For East Germans, everything shifted. The asymmetry mattered. Yet over the decades, generational turnover reshaped perception. Those born after 1989 grew up in a unified Germany. For them, the wall was a story told by parents, preserved in museums, marked by a brass line in pavement. School field trips visited memorials along Bernauer Straße. Students listened to oral histories, walked along preserved sections of border, examined fragments in glass cases. Memory became curated. At the same time, Germany's global role expanded. The unified nation emerged as the largest economy in Europe, central to the European Union's political direction. Berlin reclaimed its status as capital. The Reichstag dome symbolized transparency. The Bahn des Bundes, a series of government buildings crossing the Spree, physically bridged former divisions. The city's skyline transformed. Cranes replaced watchtowers permanently. Yet the aftershocks of reunification influenced broader debates. When the European migration crisis intensified in 2015, responses varied regionally. In some eastern towns, protests emerged against refugee housing. Observers noted parallels between communities that had experienced demographic decline and those now facing new arrivals. The memory of rapid change heightened sensitivity to further transformation. And then, in 2022, Russia's invasion of Ukraine reshaped European security thinking. Germany announced a Zeitenwende, a turning point, committing to increased defense spending. The Cold War vocabulary resurfaced cautiously. For older Berliners, the return of military discourse stirred layered memories. The wall had once been a front line. Now, decades later, geopolitical tension reappeared in different form. Yet the physical barrier did not return. Berlin's former death strip remained a park. Cyclists traced its route. Tourists paused at preserved watchtowers. Children climbed playground structures near memorial plaques. The wall in the head did not prevent coexistence. It complicated it. Over 30 years after reunification, economic indicators in eastern states improved significantly, though disparities remained. Cities like Leipzig became vibrant cultural and technological hubs. Dresden attracted semiconductor investment. Jena thrived in optics and research. In some measures, the East modernized rapidly. In others, it lagged. But the starkness of division softened. Marriage rates across former East-West lines increased. Cultural production blurred origin distinctions. Political leadership occasionally emerged from Eastern backgrounds. Angela Merkel, raised in East Germany, served as Chancellor for 16 years. Joachim Gauck, a former East German pastor and civil rights activist, became president. Representation, though uneven, existed. And gradually, the phrase new federal states replaced former East. Language shifted. Memory settled. The wall in the head did not disappear entirely, but it became less of a barricade and more of a contour, part of the landscape rather than an obstacle across it. In simple terms, reunification was not a moment. It was a long adjustment. Concrete can be dismantled in months. Trust, recognition, equality, these require time. Berlin today carries no visible barrier through its center. Yet if you walk carefully, you can still trace the path where it once stood. A thin brass line embedded in pavement marks its former course. It runs past cafes, apartment buildings, government offices. Pedestrians cross it unconsciously. Sometimes they pause. The line is subtle, but it reminds the city of what once divided it and of how much effort it took to remove it. The wall in the head remains a quieter presence. It surfaces in conversation, in elections, in economic statistics. But it coexists with something else, a shared story of peaceful transformation. Few societies have dismantled such a rigid division without war. Fewer still have absorbed the resulting change at such scale. Berlin's reconstruction was physical. Germany's reconstruction was institutional. And the reconstruction of identity continues, slower, less visible, but steady. The wall no longer defines the city's movement. It defines its memory. And memory, unlike concrete, does not demand demolition. It asks for understanding. On the surface, the fall of the Berlin Wall was a German event. It unfolded in a single city. It involved checkpoints, identity cards, concrete barriers, and crowds gathering beneath floodlights. The images broadcast that November night focused on Berliners embracing atop a divided skyline. But beneath all of this, the wall was never just local. It was structural. In simple terms, the Berlin Wall was the keystone in a much larger architecture, the visible seam of a divided Europe. When it opened, the pressure it had been holding in place began to move outward. The first tremors were already underway in 1989. In Czechoslovakia, protests gathered momentum after November 9. In Prague's Wenceslas Square, hundreds of thousands assembled, holding keys and jingling them in the air, a symbolic sound suggesting the unlocking of doors. The movement became known as the Velvet Revolution. Like Berlin, it unfolded with remarkable calm. The ruling Communist Party resigned. Václav Havel, a playwright who had spent years under surveillance and imprisonment, was elected president. The transfer of power was administrative rather than violent. In Hungary, reforms deepened. In Poland, semi-free elections had already reshaped government months before the wall fell. Across Eastern Europe, the expectation of Soviet military intervention, long the ultimate enforcement mechanism, had faded. This absence of tanks changed calculations everywhere. Romania, however, followed a different path. In December 1989, protests erupted in Timisoara and spread to Bucharest. Unlike in Prague or Berlin, the regime of Nicolae Ceausescu attempted violent suppression. Gunfire echoed in city streets. The army ultimately defected. Within days, Ceausescu and his wife were captured, tried in a hastily arranged tribunal, and executed. The images of that trial, abrupt, unceremonious, signaled the abrupt end of one of Eastern Europe's most rigid dictatorships. The wall had fallen quietly. Its shockwaves were not uniform. As 1990 unfolded, the Soviet Union itself entered a period of accelerating strain. Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms had opened public debate. Glasnost encouraged transparency. Perestroika attempted economic restructuring, but loosening control in a system built on centralized authority carries unpredictable consequences. Nationalist movements gained momentum within the Soviet republics. In the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, citizens formed human chains stretching for miles, linking hands across borders in peaceful demonstration. They sang national songs long suppressed. They demanded sovereignty. The phrase "singing revolution" captured the tone, cultural assertion, rather than armed uprising. Elsewhere, economic shortages deepened. Consumer goods became scarce. Inflation eroded stability. The Soviet Union had functioned as a command economy, tightly interlinked across republics. Energy from Siberia, grain from Ukraine, industrial output from various regions, all coordinated centrally. As political authority weakened, these supply networks faltered. In August 1991, hardline officials attempted a coup against Gorbachev, seeking to reverse reforms and restore strict control. Tanks rolled into Moscow, but the coup failed. Television images showed Boris Yeltsin standing atop a tank outside the Russian White House, addressing crowds. Soldiers hesitated to enforce orders. Within days, the coup collapsed. The Soviet Union, already fragile, disintegrated formally by the end of that year. 15 independent states emerged. The Cold War's bipolar structure dissolved. In simple terms, the wall had not caused this collapse alone, but its opening removed a central pillar of the Soviet sphere. Without East Germany as a forward anchor in Europe, the Warsaw Pact's cohesion eroded rapidly. Meanwhile, Western institutions recalibrated. NATO, originally formed as a defensive alliance against Soviet expansion, faced an altered landscape. Some speculated that it might fade without its defining adversary. Instead, it expanded. In 1999, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic joined NATO. In 2004, the Baltic states followed, along with several others. The alliance's frontier moved eastward, closer to Russia's borders. From the Western perspective, expansion offered security guarantees to states that had recently experienced Soviet domination. From the Russian perspective, it appeared as encroachment. This tension did not immediately ignite confrontation. The 1990s were often described as a unipolar moment, with the United States exercising unparalleled global influence. Russia faced internal economic turmoil. Its transition from planned economy to market capitalism produced oligarchic consolidation, wealth disparity, and political instability. In Europe, integration deepened. The European Union expanded significantly in 2004 and 2007, incorporating many former Eastern Bloc countries. Free movement of goods, services, capital, and people extended across much of the continent. Borders that had once been militarized became administrative lines within a larger union. For Germany, reunification had positioned it at the geographic and economic center of this new Europe. Berlin shifted from frontier city to hub. The Berlin Republic, as it was sometimes called, carried a different orientation than the old Bonn Republic. It looked not only westward toward Paris and Brussels, but eastward toward Warsaw, Prague, and beyond. German investment flowed into Eastern Europe. Factories were built. Supply chains integrated across borders. Yet integration was uneven. The breakup of Yugoslavia in the 1990s demonstrated that the end of the Cold War did not eliminate conflict. Ethnic tensions in the Balkans erupted into war. Sarajevo endured siege. Srebrenica witnessed atrocity. NATO intervened militarily in Kosovo in 1999, the alliance's first major combat operation not strictly defensive. The optimism of 1989 encountered complexity. Still, the symbolic power of the wall's fall persisted. It became shorthand for peaceful revolution, for civic courage, for the triumph of openness over enclosure. But symbols are not policies. As the 2000s progressed, global economic interdependence intensified. China's rise reshaped trade networks. Digital technology transformed communication. Borders became less visible in commerce, even as they remained significant in migration control. The wall's legacy acquired new layers. In Ukraine, the 1994 Budapest Memorandum had offered security assurances in exchange for nuclear disarmament. When Russia annexed Crimea in 2014 and later launched a full-scale invasion in 2022, debates about post-Cold War security arrangements intensified. Some observers looked back to the 1990 negotiations around German reunification, the 2+4 Treaty, and revisited questions about assurances, alignments, and interpretations. History's echoes returned. Meanwhile, physical walls reappeared in other parts of the world, along the US-Mexico border, between Israel and the West Bank, in fortified perimeters around enclaves and disputed territories. The Berlin Wall, once unique in scale and symbolism, became one example among many barriers built in the name of security. Yet its peaceful dismantling remained distinctive. Few walls have been removed by crowds holding identification cards rather than weapons. Few have dissolved because orders failed to arrive. In Berlin, the absence of violence on November 9 shaped the memory of the event. Across Europe, that absence influenced expectations of change. It suggested that systems could transform without catastrophic confrontation. But not every system responds the same way. The fall of the wall accelerated a reconfiguration of alliances, economies, and identities. For the generation that lived through it, the shift was seismic. For those born afterward, it is foundational background. Today, Berlin's former border route is a bike path known as the Mauerweg. Cyclists trace its 160-kilometer loop. Memorial plaques dot the route. Preserved segments stand as reminders. Visitors from around the world photograph graffiti-covered concrete near the East Side Gallery, a 1.3-kilometer stretch intentionally left standing and painted by artists in 1990. The wall has become artifact, but its shockwaves continue. European integration, NATO expansion, Russian-Western relations, debates about sovereignty and security, all are influenced, directly or indirectly, by the events set in motion when the wall opened. In simple terms, November 9 was not an endpoint. It was a hinge. On one side lay the rigid geometry of the Cold War. On the other side unfolded a fluid, multipolar era still defining itself. Berlin remains the city where that hinge turned visibly. And if you stand near the Brandenburg Gate today, where once barbed wire and guard towers dominated the view, it is possible to sense both timelines at once. Tourists mill about. Street musicians play violins. Government buildings reflect sunlight in glass facades. Yet beneath the pavement runs a subtle line marking the wall's former path. A line that once separated superpowers. A line that now separates only memory from present. The shockwaves that followed its opening did not level the world. They reshaped it. And that reshaping continues. On the surface, very little of the Berlin Wall remains. If you arrive in the city today without knowing where to look, you could walk for hours and see nothing that resembles a barrier. Traffic flows. Cyclists glide past cafes. Government buildings rise in glass and steel. Parks stretch where once there were floodlights. The wall is no longer a structure. It is a trace. But beneath all of this, the wall has not disappeared. It has changed form. In simple terms, the Berlin Wall became a memory industry. In the early 1990s, as cranes dismantled large segments of the border, debate emerged over what should be preserved. Many Berliners wanted the structure gone entirely, a clean horizon, free from reminders. Others insisted that erasing it completely would invite forgetting. The compromise was selective survival. Certain watchtowers were left standing. Sections along Bernauer Strasse were preserved as a memorial site. A stretch along the Spree River, later called the East Side Gallery, remained intact and was painted by artists from around the world. Concrete that had once been sterile and white on the eastern side now bloomed with color. Faces, slogans, abstract forms, fragments of hope. The wall, once an instrument of state control, became a canvas. Tourists began to arrive in increasing numbers. They followed guidebooks to Checkpoint Charlie, once a tense crossing point between superpowers. They posed for photographs beside reconstructed guard booths. Actors in military-style uniforms stamped souvenir passports. The transformation was subtle but profound. A site of fear became a site of performance. At Checkpoint Charlie, a small museum opened, displaying escape devices, miniature submarines, hidden car compartments, homemade hot air balloons. Stories were narrated in glass cases. Visitors read about tunnels and improvised ladders. They lingered. They purchased postcards. Memory, in this context, was curated. Elsewhere, along the former border, a thin brass line was embedded into sidewalks to mark the wall's path. It curves through residential streets, crosses tram tracks, disappears under bridges. If you follow it patiently, you can walk the entire route. The line is understated. Many pedestrians step across it without noticing. Others pause, tracing its arc with a fingertip. Berlin chose not to reconstruct the wall fully. Instead, it marked absence. The absence itself became meaningful. The Bernauer Strasse Memorial illustrates this approach clearly. There, preserved sections of the wall stand with a portion of the former death strip intact: sand, watchtower, fences. Visitors walk along elevated paths overlooking the space, reading names of those who died attempting to cross. It is quiet there. Wind moves across the cleared ground. The stillness contrasts sharply with the crowds at Checkpoint Charlie. Memory is not uniform. Some sites feel solemn. Others feel commercial. This tension reflects a broader question. How does a city balance commemoration with daily life? Berlin is not a museum. It is a living capital. Office workers hurry past preserved segments on their way to meetings. Children play in parks that were once part of the border zone. Apartment balconies overlook former patrol roads. The wall's path intersects ordinary routines. And yet, beneath all of this ordinariness lies narrative. In the decades after reunification, Berlin became a destination for what some called dark tourism, travel to sites associated with trauma or conflict. The wall joined a constellation of historical markers that include memorials to the Holocaust, Nazi-era sites, and Cold War relics. The city embraced transparency. Rather than concealing uncomfortable history, Berlin placed plaques, explanatory panels, and exhibitions throughout its landscape. At the former Stasi headquarters, now a museum, visitors walk through offices where surveillance files were once processed. They see the tools of monitoring, cameras hidden in birdhouses, recording devices concealed in suitcases. The exhibition is meticulous. The message is clear: this happened. But tourism alters scale. When thousands photograph a preserved watchtower each day, the structure shifts from surveillance post to symbol. The danger of symbolism is simplification. The wall becomes shorthand: freedom versus oppression, openness versus enclosure. While those binaries capture part of the truth, they flatten nuance. Life inside the GDR was not reducible to surveillance alone. Nor was West Berlin a flawless utopia. In simple terms, the memory of the wall risks becoming too neat. Berlin has responded by layering interpretation. Temporary art installations appear along the former border. Guided tours explore daily life rather than only escape stories. Oral history projects record voices from both sides. Yet commercialization persists. Souvenir shops sell fragments of concrete encased in plastic boxes. T-shirts display stylized graffiti. Coffee mugs bear images of barbed wire and slogans. The wall's aesthetic has been domesticated. It decorates living rooms. This transformation is not entirely cynical. Symbols travel. Fragments of the wall stand in cities around the world, in Washington, D.C., London, Seoul. They are displayed in parks, universities, corporate courtyards. A once localized structure now occupies global space. Each fragment carries a story, but the story changes depending on context. In some places, the wall symbolizes democratic victory. In others, it represents caution, a reminder of how quickly societies can divide. Meanwhile, Berlin itself continues to evolve. The former border zone, once empty and guarded, became some of the city's most valuable real estate. Potsdamer Platz filled with glass towers. Luxury apartments rose along the Spree. Government buildings stretched across the river in the Bahn des Bundes, physically linking east and west. Developers saw opportunity where patrol jeeps once rolled. Not everyone welcomed this transformation. Critics argued that rapid commercialization risked erasing the wall's gravity. That memory might be overshadowed by shopping centers. The debate continues. Yet the city has maintained certain anchors. The topography of Terror Museum documents the institutions of Nazi repression. The memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe sits near the Brandenburg Gate. The Wall Memorial stands along Bernauer Straße. Berlin does not isolate its histories. It layers them. In simple terms, the wall exists in dialogue with older traumas. It is one chapter in a longer narrative of division and reconstruction. And then there is the East Side Gallery. This preserved stretch of wall became an open-air art exhibition in 1990, shortly after the border opened. Artists from around the world painted murals expressing hope, reconciliation, satire. One of the most famous images, the fraternal kiss between Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev and East German leader Erich Honecker, became iconic. The irony was deliberate. A gesture once symbolic of political solidarity was reframed as commentary. Over time, weather and vandalism faded some murals. Restoration efforts followed. Controversies emerged when nearby development projects threatened sections of the gallery. Public protest defended preservation. The wall, once imposed without public consultation, now required civic negotiation. Its afterlife was participatory. Walking along the East Side Gallery today, you hear multiple languages. Cameras click. Street performers play music. The Spree River glides quietly beside the painted concrete. It is difficult to reconcile this atmosphere with the floodlit vigilance of the 1970s. And yet, the two are inseparable. Without the former, the latter would not exist. Memory in Berlin is not static. It is curated, contested, commercialized, and protected simultaneously. The wall's transformation into a cultural artifact raises broader questions about how societies remember division. Is it enough to preserve fragments? Does tourism dilute gravity, or does it spread awareness? Perhaps the answer lies in proximity. The wall's most powerful reminders are not the brightly painted sections, but the subtle traces, the brass line in pavement, the preserved watchtower glimpsed unexpectedly at the end of a quiet street. They interrupt routine gently. They ask no dramatic reaction. They simply mark where something once stood. In the early 1990s, some Berliners predicted that, within a generation, the wall would be forgotten entirely. That has not happened. Instead, it has shifted from immediate experience to inherited story. Schoolchildren visit memorials as part of curriculum. University seminars examine Cold War policy. Public anniversaries, 10 years, 2030, draw crowds and speeches. But daily life continues around them. Cafes operate near preserved segments. Offices hum with digital work. The river reflects evening light across both former sides of the city. The wall has become quiet. Its loudest moment was its fall. Its longest phase is remembrance. And perhaps that is fitting. Structures built to divide rarely vanish without residue. Berlin chose not to erase that residue. It chose to embed it. The wall no longer dictates movement. It informs perspective. Visitors come seeking a story of freedom. Residents navigate a city that carries scars lightly but visibly. Concrete, once weaponized, now educates. The floodlights are gone. The sand is grass. The guard towers are observation points for reflection rather than surveillance. And beneath all of this transformation lies a simple truth. The wall was never only concrete. It was an idea. And ideas, even when dismantled, leave impressions. Berlin has decided to live with those impressions, not as barriers, but as reminders. On the surface, November 9, 1989, appeared to mark the end of an era of walls. The images that circled the globe, young people dancing on concrete, guards shaking hands with civilians, champagne spraying into cold night air, seemed to confirm a larger narrative. The 20th century's most famous barrier had opened. The Cold War was dissolving. Borders, many believed, would gradually soften in a world knit together by trade, technology, and shared institutions. For a moment, the future felt horizontal. Open markets expanded. Airlines multiplied routes. The European Union deepened integration. The internet emerged as a new, borderless commons. And yet, beneath all of this optimism, a different pattern was forming. In simple terms, the fall of one wall did not end the impulse to build others. It relocated it. By the early 21st century, the number of physical border barriers worldwide had increased significantly. Some were fences topped with razor wire. Others were reinforced concrete, fitted with cameras and motion sensors. Many were justified as security measures to prevent smuggling, terrorism, unauthorized migration. From the U.S. Mexico border to the Israeli West Bank barrier, from fortified enclaves in North Africa to fences along parts of Eastern Europe, the vocabulary of division returned in new form. The Berlin Wall had been a product of ideological containment, designed to prevent citizens from leaving a political system. Many contemporary barriers are constructed to prevent outsiders from entering. The direction changed. The logic did not entirely disappear. In Berlin, preserved segments of the wall stand as reminders of separation. Visitors often reflect on how unnatural division appears in retrospect, how artificial it seems to slice a city in two. Yet in other regions, new barriers are defended as pragmatic, necessary, rational. The difference is context. But the structure, concrete, steel, surveillance, remains familiar. Technology has also altered the nature of division. The Berlin Wall relied on floodlights, watchtowers, sand, and patrols. It was visible and material. Today, many borders are layered with digital monitoring. Drones, biometric databases, thermal imaging, facial recognition. A smart wall does not always look imposing. It may consist of sensors embedded underground, cameras hidden in poles, software scanning data. In simple terms, the modern wall can be invisible. It exists in code as much as in concrete. And beyond physical borders, another form of separation has grown, the digital partition. In the early 1990s, the internet was imagined as a boundaryless network. Information would flow freely. Authoritarian control would weaken under the pressure of open communication. But states adapted. Firewalls were constructed not of steel, but of filters. Certain countries developed sophisticated systems to block, redirect, or monitor online traffic. Content became regionally segmented. Platforms complied with local regulations. Algorithms curated individualized information streams. Where the Berlin Wall once separated two public narratives, digital ecosystems now fragment into millions of personalized realities. The filter bubble is not a border drawn on a map. It is a border drawn around attention. This fragmentation complicates memory. In 1989, the fall of the wall was experienced collectively. Television broadcasts synchronized perception. A shared image circulated widely and immediately. Today, perception is distributed. News spreads through social media, shaped by algorithmic sorting. Narratives compete within segmented audiences. The spectacle of division is no longer centralized. It is networked. Meanwhile, geopolitical tension has re-emerged in Europe. The 2022 invasion of Ukraine reshaped security assumptions. Images of trenches, fortifications, and anti-tank barriers returned to European consciousness. Countries along NATO's eastern flank reinforced defenses. Military spending increased. Though no new wall cut through Berlin, the language of deterrence resurfaced. Germany announced a Zeitenwende, a turning point, committing to renewed defense investment. The optimism of the 1990s gave way to caution. History did not repeat itself, but it echoed. The Berlin Wall's legacy thus occupies an ambiguous position. It is celebrated as a triumph of peaceful civic action. Yet the conditions that produced it, fear, rivalry, ideological distrust, have not vanished from global politics. If anything, they have diversified. Migration pressures, intensified by climate change and conflict, place new strain on borders. Rising sea levels threaten low-lying regions. Drought displaces agricultural communities. The movement of people becomes less optional and more necessary. States respond with layered policies, humanitarian aid, visa restrictions, detention centers, walls. The moral clarity of 1989 becomes more complex when applied to contemporary migration debates. Many celebrate the courage of East Germans who crossed borders seeking freedom. Yet policies toward migrants in the Mediterranean or along other frontiers often emphasize control and deterrence. The difference lies in identity, who is seen as us and who as other. The Berlin Wall once prevented emigration. Modern barriers often prevent immigration. Both operate through exclusion. In Berlin itself, the contrast is visible. Visitors stand at preserved sections of the wall, reading about individuals who risked their lives to cross. Plaques describe tunnels, improvised balloons, split families. These stories are framed as narratives of resilience and aspiration. Meanwhile, global headlines describe migrant boats intercepted, asylum applications processed, border fortifications debated. The ethical tension is subtle but persistent. Does the lesson of 1989 extend beyond its historical moment? Or is it contained within it? Berlin's own evolution suggests that division is never static. After reunification, economic disparities and political friction persisted. The wall in the head lingered. Yet over time, integration deepened. Difference did not disappear, but it became navigable. Perhaps the wall's most enduring lesson lies not in the absence of barriers, but in the capacity for redefinition. Concrete was once unquestioned in Berlin. Then it became negotiable. In simple terms, walls endure as long as belief sustains them. This does not imply that all modern barriers will dissolve as peacefully. The Berlin Wall's fall was facilitated by unique circumstances: reform in Moscow, restraint by security forces, civic discipline in demonstrations. Not every border dispute contains such alignment. Still, the memory of 1989 offers a template, not of inevitability, but of possibility. It reminds observers that structures presented as permanent may not be, that administrative systems can falter under civic insistence, that fear can recede without artillery. The preservation of wall fragments in cities worldwide reinforces this template. In Washington, D.C., a segment stands near diplomatic buildings, a reminder that division once dominated Europe's center. In Seoul, fragments appear in exhibitions addressing Korea's ongoing partition. In corporate campuses, pieces are displayed as metaphors for overcoming obstacles. The wall's afterlife extends beyond Germany. And yet, within Berlin, its presence is quieter than its global symbolism suggests. Children skateboard along former border paths. Couples picnic near preserved watchtowers. Government employees commute past the brass line, marking the old divide without breaking stride. Memory has been absorbed into routine. This absorption may be the most profound transformation. The wall is no longer extraordinary. It is contextual. In the decades since its fall, Germany has navigated additional crises: financial turbulence in the Eurozone, debates over migration, the COVID-19 pandemic, energy transition. Each challenge tests cohesion, but none has reinstated the kind of structural partition embodied by the wall. The idea of sealing Berlin internally now seems implausible. Yet globally, division persists. New walls are justified as temporary measures, emergency responses, security enhancements. History suggests that temporary structures can harden. The Berlin Wall was initially barbed wire. It became reinforced concrete. Then it became parkland. Its lifespan spanned less than 30 years. Its memory spans generations. The modern world's barriers may not follow the same arc, but they will carry their own legacies. As the 21st century advances, climate migration, technological surveillance, and geopolitical rivalry will likely intensify debates about borders. The Berlin Wall provides a case study in how rigid systems can unravel, and how their unraveling reshapes not only cities, but continents. On the surface, the wall is gone. Beneath all of this, it remains instructive. It warns against the seduction of permanence. It demonstrates the fragility of enforced separation. It complicates triumphal narratives by revealing the cost of division, economic, psychological, familial. And it invites reflection on contemporary choices. Every barrier, whether concrete or digital, is constructed with intention. Every barrier alters human movement. Berlin's experience suggests that even the most formidable structures are subject to revision. But revision requires convergence, political flexibility, civic courage, and sometimes simple administrative confusion. November 9 was not planned as revolution. It unfolded because a sentence was misread, because crowds gathered, because guards hesitated. History often turns on such fragile hinges. The world without the Berlin Wall is not a world without walls. It is a world more aware of what walls mean. Whether that awareness will prevent future divisions remains uncertain. But the image of Berliners crossing freely beneath floodlights persists, a reminder that barriers can open, sometimes quietly, sometimes unexpectedly. And when they do, the shockwaves extend far beyond the city that built them. On the surface, the Berlin Wall no longer interrupts anything. No guard towers cast shadows across apartment blocks. No sand lies raked for footprints. No floodlights bleach the night into artificial daylight. Cars move freely through intersections that once ended in concrete. Cyclists follow paths that were once patrol roads. The wall is gone. And yet, if you rise early enough and walk slowly enough, you can still find it. Not as a barrier, as a corridor. There is a path that traces almost the entire former route of the wall, the Berliner Mauerweg. It stretches for roughly 160 kilometers around the city, looping through residential streets, forest edges, industrial zones, riversides, and quiet suburban stretches where birds now nest in trees that grew from once barren soil. In simple terms, the wall has become a trail. You can walk it, bike it, pause at information panels that explain what stood there decades ago. The experience is not dramatic. It is calm, almost ordinary. And perhaps that is the most profound transformation. Because the original wall thrived on tension. It divided noise from silence, freedom from confinement, known from unknown. It demanded vigilance. It defined identities. The corridor that replaces it invites reflection. If you begin near Bernauer Strasse, one of the most historically charged stretches, you pass preserved segments of the border complex. A watchtower stands behind fencing. The old death strip remains partially intact, its emptiness now framed for contemplation. There is a small chapel there, the Chapel of Reconciliation, built on the footprint of a church that once stood on the border and was demolished by the East German authorities in 1985. The new structure is made of rammed earth and wood, circular and quiet. The old church was destroyed because it obstructed the view. The new chapel stands because it acknowledges absence. Visitors enter softly. The interior is simple. Light filters down through an opening in the ceiling. Silence gathers in layers. It is not a triumphant space. It is a patient one. Walking further, the preserved wall segments give way to open ground. Grass stretches where fences once ran. Informational plaques describe escape attempts, some successful, many not. Names appear on metal panels. Dates. Ages. The simplicity of these markers carries weight. They resist spectacle. The city could have rebuilt a dramatic reconstruction of the wall across its full path. It chose instead to embed memory in fragments. A brass line set into the pavement curves through neighborhoods. Children hop across it without ceremony. Office workers stride over it on their way to meetings. Occasionally, someone pauses, aligning a foot along the strip, imagining its former height. The act of stepping across a former border is now unremarkable, but the knowledge of what once stood there alters the step. As you follow the Mauerweg northward, the landscape softens. The path winds through wooded areas where the border once cut through forest. Birds sing where patrol vehicles once idled. The stillness can feel almost exaggerated. The wall demanded constant alertness. The trail invites ease. And yet, beneath all of this tranquility lies complexity. The memory of division does not fade evenly. For those who lived through it, the wall remains biographical. For those born after 1989, it is historical. Generations experience it differently. Younger Berliners often treat the wall as background, an inherited context rather than a lived rupture. They navigate a city unified in infrastructure, education, employment. They frequent neighborhoods that once lay in different political systems without hesitation. Yet subtle differences persist. Economic disparities between eastern and western districts have narrowed but not vanished. Cultural patterns retain traces of divergent pasts. Political preferences sometimes reflect lingering perceptions of marginalization. The wall in the head, that invisible boundary of memory and habit, has softened over time but has not entirely dissolved. And perhaps it never fully will. No society resets to zero. The wall's disappearance did not erase the decades it stood. It altered their meaning. If you cycle further along the former border, you eventually reach areas that were once remote, peripheral. The death strip, by design, cut through urban and rural spaces alike. Now, these peripheral stretches are quiet parks and greenways. Joggers pass. Dogs pull at leashes. The path occasionally widens where watchtowers once stood. A few towers remain, preserved as vertical reminders. They look smaller than they did in archival photographs. Scale changes with context. Without armed guards and floodlights, the towers seem almost modest. But imagination restores gravity. In the city center, the former border intersects with sites of layered memory. Near the Brandenburg Gate, tourists photograph the restored monument, often unaware that it stood isolated in a no-man's land for decades. The Reichstag dome, designed by Norman Foster, reflects sunlight across a skyline that once felt fractured. Government buildings stretch across the Spree in the Bahn des Bundes, physically linking areas once separated. Architecture has been used deliberately to suture. Glass replaces concrete. Transparency replaces opacity. Yet architecture alone does not resolve history. The Stasi files remain archived. Scholars continue to analyze the mechanisms of surveillance. Public debates occasionally flare when new documents surface, revealing personal betrayals or forgotten injustices. Memory requires maintenance. It cannot be automated. Anniversaries bring renewed attention. On significant dates, the 25th anniversary, the 30th, installations appear along the former border. Light projections trace its path at night. Balloons rise into the sky, marking where concrete once stood. For a few hours, the line becomes visible again. Then it dissolves. This temporary visibility mirrors the wall's contemporary presence. It is not gone. It is not dominant. It is ambient. The broader world continues to wrestle with division. New barriers rise elsewhere. Migration routes shift. Digital partitions shape discourse. The Berlin Wall's memory is invoked in speeches, in documentaries, in cautionary comparisons. Yet here, along the Mauerweg, the lesson feels less rhetorical. It feels tactile. You can touch the preserved concrete, pitted, graffitied, worn by weather and hands. You can run your fingers along its rough surface and sense its materiality. Then you can step away and continue walking. The wall no longer blocks. It accompanies. The quiet corridor today is not an absence of tension. It is a space where tension has been metabolized into narrative. Cities rarely receive second chances to redefine themselves so completely. Berlin did. It transformed a border into a backbone, a linear park, a memory trail, a civic spine. The transformation was neither instant nor effortless. Economic strain, political debate, cultural friction marked the decades after reunification. Some residents still speak of lost stability or lost opportunity. Others speak of regained freedom. The story is not singular, but it is shared. As evening settles along the former border, lights from apartments flicker on. Conversations drift through open windows. Trams hum in the distance. The city breathes without interruption. It is easy, in this calm, to forget the urgency that once defined these coordinates. And perhaps forgetting is not entirely negative. Memory need not dominate daily life to remain instructive. The wall's physical removal did not erase its imprint. It redistributed it into museums, into plaques, into school curricula, into family stories told at kitchen tables, into political language whenever division threatens cohesion. In simple terms, the wall became infrastructure of memory rather than infrastructure of control. That shift is subtle but profound. The quiet corridor today does not demand vigilance. It invites awareness. It suggests that division can be engineered and dismantled. It reminds that permanence is often provisional. It demonstrates that societies can survive rupture, though not without scars. And it leaves open a question that extends beyond Berlin. What other walls, visible or invisible, do we accept as inevitable? The Berlin Wall stood for 28 years. It felt immovable. It became movable. Its concrete dissolved into grass and glass. Its ideology faded into history textbooks. Its memory persists. If you walk the Mauerweg at dawn, before traffic thickens, you might notice dew collecting on the grass where patrol vehicles once drove. The air is still. The city feels suspended between past and present. You can trace the route quietly. No one stops you. No one checks identification. No one watches from a tower. The freedom is unremarkable. And that is its greatest triumph. The wall's final transformation was not into art or souvenir or museum exhibit. It was into normalcy. The ability to cross a street without permission. To visit a friend without paperwork. To choose direction without consequence. The quiet corridor today holds that simplicity. It does not celebrate loudly. It does not dramatize. It rests. And in resting, it reminds. The transition from closed to open is not guaranteed. It requires care. It requires vigilance of a different kind, not against neighbors, but against fear. Berlin's former border now functions as a seam rather than a scar. Seams hold fabric together. They acknowledge that pieces were once separate. They create strength through connection. The wall once separated clocks, systems, futures. Now the city keeps a single time. Morning deliveries move freely. School bells ring without political meaning. Trams cross invisible lines without hesitation. The second clock, the one that measured tension, has quieted. Its tick remains in archives and memorials. But on the streets, the rhythm is shared. In the end, the story of the Berlin Wall is not only about its construction or its fall. It is about its afterlife. How concrete becomes parkland. How fear becomes reflection. How division becomes lesson. And how, in the soft light of an ordinary morning, a city can walk calmly across ground that once divided the world.